Selection with Kyra, where you can get the real on today's hot topics.
Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Vibe Selection. I am your host, Kyra, and on today's episode, I have joining me entertainment lawyer Gordon Firemark, also known as the podcast lawyer. And today we will be discussing the legalities when it comes to podcasting. So thank you so much for joining me today, Gordon. How are you?
I'm great, Kyra. Thanks so much for having me on.
Absolutely. No problem. It's a pleasure. So what I want to get started with is what exactly made you want to become an entertainment lawyer or come into law in the first place? What inspired you?
Well, for me, it was always showbiz first. So I got exposed to live theater when I was very young. I was in kindergarten and I was in a K through 12 school in the Massachusetts area. And they brought the kindergarten class in to watch a dress rehearsal of the high school kids doing their production of Oliver. And I'll tell you, they sat us down and the lights went on and the curtains started moving around and the action happened on stage. And I was mesmerized. I was drawn into that. And I just knew that was what I wanted to be a part of. And so cut to, probably, 7 or 8 years later, we'd moved across the country and I was starting to get into, middle school kid. And I'm starting to get into some sort of low grade trouble with my friends and things like that. And for some reason, the school principal pulls me aside and says, I want you to run the lights and sound for the school variety show. And, he just tapped right back into that. And so I was drawn back into the theater stuff and did that through high school, started college as a theater major, switched up into radio, television, and film after a little while. And law school didn't become a thing for me until I was a senior in college. And a professor suggested I should think about it. I laughed her out of the room and then I thought about it. So worked in the television industry for a little while as a producer, live television, sports, and events kind of coverage before I realized I did want to go to law school. And the writers had gone on strike that year. So that was a good time for me to go to school. And that was it ever since. So there was never any question it was going to be entertainment law. It was just whether the law was the thing or not. So.
Yeah. And so you've been practicing law for a few decades now. And you're also known, like I said in the beginning, as the podcast lawyer. So what kind of made you want to get on the legal side when it comes to podcasting in general?
Well, I was already working with theater people and film and television production kinds of things. And when I got hooked on podcasting myself as a podcaster, I went looking for the legal resources on the subject, just mainly to educate myself about what might be different from those other areas. And I found nothing there. There wasn't anything. This was early on in the podcasting history. And I started my own show and then I went looking for those resources. And since there weren't any, I decided, okay, I'll sit down and do the research. And I wrote a book. And that positioned me as a bit of an expert. And now that's 12 years ago or so. And that's how I'm now known as the podcast lawyer.
I love that. And you know what? Podcasting has become something that almost everybody and their mother is into nowadays. And it's still kind of relatively new. I know that you say you did it 12 years ago, but it's really just starting to be recognized as an actual means of being able to make even money off of podcasting, because before this was just a hobby for a lot of people to do. And so it was important for me to actually have you on today because there's so many people that I know that are into podcasting. A lot of them also don't have the background in broadcast media. And I know that you actually got your law degree at the University of Oregon you got your BA for broadcasting and communications, right? So, a lot of people don't come in there with come into podcasting with that background. So they miss out on the legalities of when it comes to it because they think they can just create a show and say whatever they want, but they don't realize that there's rules and regulations in all aspects, regardless, if you're on CNN or NBC or whatever, you have to there's legal ramifications for things if you don't say them in the right way. So I want to get into what are some things that you should not say when it comes to a podcast, and how do you legally protect yourself?
Well, things that you should not say, I was going to say you should only tell the truth, basically, because, libel and slander, that's defamation, is false statements that are factual in nature that make, hurt somebody's reputation or something like that. But then I realized, well, there's a lot of, fiction scripted stuff as well. And so it is okay to make up stories as long as it's not about real people that, where it's going to hurt their reputation. So that's the big thing is be truthful when truth is a factor, or be very careful not to injure people's reputations or even invade their privacy when you're doing scripted fiction kinds of things. So it's, defamation is one area. Privacy, revealing, traditionally private things, people's medical history, sexual preferences, sexual orientation, sexual histories, educational histories, those kinds of things. You need consent from the people to talk about those kinds of things, unless it's newsworthy, unless there's a real public interest in knowing this stuff. Those kinds of things. Obviously, don't incite violence and don't don't threaten government officials and things like that. But actually, free speech is a pretty strong thing here in the U.S. So almost anything goes.
Yeah. And also, I know that you're speaking of consent. I know that you created a podcast guest release form.
Yes, indeed.
So what made you want to create a podcast guest release form? Because I've noticed that in the world of podcasting, a lot of people do not give guest release forms. Like I said, there's so many people that don't really have broadcasting backgrounds. And so they don't really know the proper channels and the ways that they should go about, handling the business side of the podcast that, ultimately they miss out on that step. So why is a podcast guest release form necessary in this field?
Well, first off, let me say that, we talk about a broadcasting background, and that's great for people to have a background, and understand how production works and how to get good sound quality and the general basics of getting your message out. But podcasting is not the same as broadcast media. It's not like radio. And one of the big things that I see people who come out of the radio world saying is, well, we never got a release when I was working in radio, or we never worried about this other aspect, whatever aspect it is. And I just have to say, hey, different medium, different rules. This is sort of my crusade, Kyra. I feel that a written release that is consent to record and a promise, that you can use what you record in any medium you want forever. That's where it's really different from the broadcast. In radio, it's on the air and then it's gone. And people either heard it or they didn't. Maybe there's a recording somewhere, but it doesn't get it's not an evergreen kind of medium like this is. So this is more like film in that regard, where we do expect everybody who's in a film to sign a contract that says you can capture my performance and use it. Same thing for podcasts. We want to consent to the capture. And by the way, in not all states is recording somebody legal without their consent anyway. So you want the consent, you want that irrevocability. They can't withdraw their permission later. That's a problem that I've seen happen a few times. And you want them to promise that they're not going to sue you if the material is embarrassing to them or does cause them some kind of harm, or invades their privacy or reveals stuff that they have second thoughts about later. So it really is a tool for getting people thinking, okay, this is a serious thing. It's not just a lark.
And, a lot of times when it comes to podcasting, people, I know you just mentioned the fact of, you want to make it so if you have the podcast guest release form, if the episode comes out and it's not to the guest's liking, they can't try to sue you because they don't like the way that they're portrayed on there. Right. So what are some other issues that you can run into by not having a podcast guest release form besides that?
Well, you might have questions about the ownership of the content that you've created, because the way copyright law works is when two people get together and create something that is a single unitary whole, like a podcast episode, in the absence of a clear definition of their intent, they are joint owners of that, joint authors of that copyrighted work. And so you could theoretically have a guest claiming, hey, I co-own that episode. I want a copy. I'm going to publish it my way. And, those kinds of things. So I feel very strongly that, there should only be the podcaster as the owner of the material. So that's another component of the guest release for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, if you're a podcaster, you definitely don't want to get into a situation where someone is trying to, take ownership of the property that's ultimately yours because it's your show. So, that could be very detrimental to a podcaster. So for everybody that's listening out right now, and if you are someone that is thinking about becoming a podcaster, if you are a podcaster, I'm on some podcast support group sites. And this is a question that comes up a lot is like, it does, if I do have a guest on and they don't really like the way they're portrayed, should I just take it off? What should I do in a situation like that? Do they actually own the legal rights? So yeah, like the fact that you created this guest release form for the show, like it's very useful, and people can also find that on your website, right?
Yeah, well, it's actually got its own little landing page. It's at podcastrelease.com. And in exchange, it's not free, it's in exchange for your email address, and I will send you a few emails afterwards to tell you how to use it and about some of the other things that I offer. But it's an opt-out, opt-in, opt-out kind of thing. Very easy to do. I will say, by the way, just because you have a guest release that says you have the right to publish this stuff doesn't mean if somebody calls you or writes you and says, hey, this is hurting me because of this, or I'm I said something, my boss doesn't like it, I'm going to get fired. You can still take it down. It's just that it's now your choice. And that's what I think is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you have any other release forms that you have on your site? Like, do you have one for musicians? Let's just say they come on your show and they want to play their music. I know that there's a lot of legalities when it comes to musicians coming on and playing their music as well. So is that something that you offer?
Yeah, we have a whole sort of, store full of forms that you can purchase from us. The guest release is free. We also have one actually that's more oriented for like live streamers who are doing video as well as audio. That's at guestrelease.com. It's basically the same document with a little extra language about video and that kind of thing. But the rest of the forms and things are, they're available on our website at GordonFiremark.com. So you can check that out.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what are some legal issues that you can run into when it comes to having a musician on your show and they want to play your music? What are the necessary steps that you need to go through in order to make sure that you get clearance on that type of music?
Well, you nailed it. You have to do clearance on the music, or really anybody else's content that you incorporate into your show. Because when you are creating something and you're using other people's stuff, well, those other people own it, right? A copyright comes into existence the moment a creator makes something original and fixes it in some tangible form. So recording a spoken word that's recorded, or a book or a poem or anything that's written down, that's copyrighted, protected from the moment it's created. And so when you incorporate that material, if you don't have permission, you are violating the exclusive rights of the copyright holder. And that copyright infringement can be a pretty troublesome thing. It certainly, the most common thing is it just gets taken down by the hosting company when they receive a notice, but you could get sued. And nobody wants to fight those battles in court if you can avoid it. So, with music, it's especially tricky because there's actually two copyrights for every recorded song. There's the copyright in the musical composition, the work that the songwriters did. And then there's also the copyright in the recording that is made usually by a record company, or sometimes the artists do it, but they often sell it to a record company. So you've got to stop and think about which copyrights am I using and who do I need permission from? Typically, that's a music publishing company for the songwriters part of it, and the record company for the recording part of it. And then you get into the more complicated challenge of, well, what rights do you need? You're incorporating that music into a new recording. So you're making what we call a derivative work, and that requires one kind of a license, but you're also performing the work. You're streaming it. Podcast players are often streamed over the internet. That stream is what we call a performance. And that is administered by different outfits called ASCAP and BMI, and there's a couple of others, CSAC and GMR here in the US. And in every country, there are other performing rights organizations that actually collect royalties on a sort of blanket basis for these kinds of things. So I sort of jokingly say you've got four-stop shopping when you want to go get these rights, because you need the two kinds of rights for each of the two kinds of copyrights. So it gets very tricky and very complicated. Unfortunately, there's just no shortcut to this. And so unfortunately, it's still hard to use music in podcasts.
Yeah. And, that's why a lot of times I've known some other podcasters that wanted to use, artist music on their show. And it's just such a headache to go through all the legal ramifications in order to get the clearance for it. And that's why a lot of podcasts in general don't really play music. Because I know there's some people that are like, oh, why is the music played on podcasts? Well, this is some of the reasons behind why it's not. It's very different from radio, and that they have licensing agreements and they have agreements with the publishers and so forth to be able to legally play the music on air that podcasters do not. So that's a lot of good information for people to know out there.
I will say, Kyra, if you're a podcaster and you're doing a show about new artists, unsigned bands and things like that, it gets a little easier because you're dealing directly with that artist and you can get a music license directly from them. But again, this is an area where you got to get it in writing, because a year from now, when that artist has now signed with Sony Records or something, and then Sony puts the song out and claims ownership of it, they're going to come and want to take down your show. So you've got to be able to prove I had permission when we made the show, and that permission continues. So get it in writing. That's the lawyer's mantra.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I've also gotten a lot of questions from other podcasters when it comes to them having guests on their show, if they are a guest-based podcast or if they have guests on their show on occasions. A lot of times they're in question of how do they brief the guests before they come on the actual show, before the show actually starts. So what are some things that you feel like if a guest is coming on the podcast needs to be aware of before they actually record the show?
Well, I think the guest release is a good start on that, to call it briefing, I guess, because it's saying, here's what I'm expecting from you, Mr. Guest or Ms. Guest. Beyond that, I think that's going to vary, depending on the nature of the show. I think it's sort of incumbent on the guest to know who they're talking to and what kind of a show they're going on. But it's not a bad idea to have a one sheet or a canned email that you send out to every guest saying, here's what our show's about, here's who our audience is, here's the kind of things we want to talk about. And then maybe, I'm not a big fan of giving them the questions in advance, but you could sort of say, here are the 5 topics I want to cover in our show. And that way the guest can feel prepared, feel comfortable about it. And I will say, if you ask not surprise questions, but if you always ask the same couple of questions at the end, what's your favorite ice cream flavor or something like that, it's nice to let the guest know that too, so they can at least start to formulate an answer for that. But beyond that, I think it really is on the guest to know what they're doing and who they're talking to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you said a little earlier in the show that there are some things that some of the things that you should and should not say on a podcast in general, but that was more so in regards to the actual podcaster. Yeah. So are there anything as far as guests that come on the show that they should know that they legally can and cannot say when it comes to being a guest?
It's the same. Yeah, it's the same rules. I think, if you can let the guest know, hey, if we're talking about other people, please be sure you're speaking truth or opinion and not, questionable comments about things or whatever. I don't think that, that ultimately it's going to be incumbent on the podcaster to think critically about what's said and maybe pull stuff out of the interview or call out the guest when they say something controversial or just downright wrong and say, wait a minute, I'm not sure that's really true. Where do you get your information? You can sort of it comes down to being a journalist, really. And I think one thing that a lot of new podcasters fail to think of themselves as journalists. They just think, I'm just, having this fun conversation with people.
Exactly.
But you're presenting information to the public at large. And so you're doing a form of journalism. And I think we need to take it seriously.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of legal ramifications if you do not stand stand within those fine lines of things that you can and cannot say, no matter if you have a background in, media.
Right.
You have to still follow the rules. So that goes for everybody that has a platform out there. And for all those other podcasters that are thinking about getting into podcasting, these are things that you should definitely take into consideration if you are going to start your show. So, yeah. So I want to actually get into trademarking and copywriting now. So should you trademark and copyright your podcast?
Well, as I said earlier, copyright springs into existence from the moment the work is created. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have to do anything, but you own the copyright from the moment you create and fix a work. As long as it's original material, you own it. There is a registration system here in the United States. Not all countries have registration systems, but here in the US we do. And it's a great idea to register your copyrights. But I'll tell you, there's an expense associated with it, $50, $60, I think it's $65 now to register a copyright. So if you're going to do an episode every week, that's not an insignificant amount of money to be throwing at the U.S. government for the privilege of getting a little notice that, okay, we have your copyright on file. But the advantages of registering are that if there is an infringement, if somebody does copy your episode, you have the ability, to hire a lawyer who will be able to get attorney's fees out of the defendant if you win the case. So attorney's fees and also statutory damages. You wouldn't have to prove your actual out-of-pocket losses as a consequence of that infringement. So that can be the difference between being able to sue and not being able to sue, because, let's face it, lawyers cost a lot of money and litigation is a long, drawn out, expensive process. So if you can shift the burden of the legal fees to the defendant, that's valuable. It's also, sort of prima facie or, first blush evidence of ownership of the copyright. So it's a good idea to register within 3 months of the first time you publish the episode. And I think it is a good idea to get it done, but you might have to triage it and decide which episodes are you sort of most worried about or likely to have a problem. You can register at any time, but you can't get those attorney's fees and statutory damages unless you've registered within the first 3 months and before the infringement occurs. So
okay.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, no. Go ahead.
No, I was finished.
So, and I would definitely encourage a lot of people, for all those people that are wanting to get out there and start a podcast, to go and register the trademark for your podcast, especially since there is a lot of people that are stealing other people's content, especially when it comes to, you hear a lot of YouTube bloggers talk about it, influencers and so forth. Yeah. So definitely handle the business side of that and definitely go register, the trademark for the name of your podcast so nobody can steal that. And there's also ways for people to be able to look up to make sure that the name of their show is not already taken, right? So I know some of the ways are looking through the podcast directories like Apple or Spotify or whatever to see if the name is already taken. But what are some other ways that people can figure out whether or not the name for their potential podcast is not taken by someone else?
Well, first off, let me say that not every title for a podcast is going to be registrable or protectable as a trademark. My own show is an example where when I first started it was the term entertainment law update was very descriptive. Tells you exactly what you're going to get. Mm-hmm. Descriptive terms are not registrable as trademarks. They can't be protected that way. Now, over time, you can acquire the distinctiveness that's required for trademark protection. And my show being 12 years old now, I think I've got the distinctiveness covered. It's what we call secondary meaning. in the mind of the consumer or the public. But the best advice would be, when choosing a title for your show, is choose something that's distinctive, that stands apart and sets you apart from the competition, and then register it. So the first step to being distinctive is what you said: searching, finding out if there's an existing title already out there. You can search the trademark office records at uspto.gov. Here in the U.S., searching all the podcast directories and doing a thorough Google search or search engine search is a great idea. And then if you're really serious and you're planning to register your trademark for your show, I would say do a comprehensive trademark availability search. That is something there are companies out there that do them. They're a little bit, the result that you get from these, I'll tell you, I did one last week. It was 1,800 pages long.
Wow.
The result, because it lists every potentially conflicting, brand out there. And they want to be as inclusive as possible. So they're careful. So it pays to maybe use a lawyer to do that part of it. And, as I said, it's a few $100s to the third party search fee, a search company. And then, you might have to pay a few $100s to a lawyer. But if you're investing in starting a new venture, I think that's a money well spent. And conducting a really comprehensive search is the best way to know that your title is clear.
Yeah. And, a couple of weeks ago, I actually had a trademark and copyright lawyer actually on the show. And we talked a little bit about we talked all about trademarking and copywriting. But I know one of the things that she said, one of the things that I did ask her was, on a lot of the times you see other people say when it comes to trademarking or copywriting, they have those online sites where you can go to for legal advice, or you can have them get release forms from them. So do you feel like it is a good idea for someone to get legal advice from these sites or go to them in order for any type of legal assistance?
I think we're talking about the companies with words like Zoom or Rocket in their names. And
yes,
I actually think of these companies as basically the equivalent of a legal document vending machines. And legal stuff is something that I think needs to be custom tailored often, not always. There are some, you can get a simple will or a simple guest release or something like that from a vending machine, and it'll be fine 99% of the time. But when you're doing something a little more specific, and I would say that trademark registration is something that requires some specific attention. I would say using one of these companies is a little like getting a haircut from a vending machine. You got a box with a hole in the bottom. You're going to stick your head in there and pay $1 to get a haircut. You might come out looking great, or you might
or not,
or you might lose an ear.
Exactly. More than likely, you're going to lose that ear.
So be thoughtful and careful about this. You get what you pay for.
Exactly. True. So don't cut the corners, y'all. Go there, get an actual lawyer, do whatever you got to do. Like I said to Jamie on the episode that we did about trademarking, I said, if you got to pawn some jewelry, honey, you got to do what you got to do, to get that lawyer, to get somebody legitimate to help you with the process, then you got to do that. So, hey,
I think people anticipate the legal fees for these kinds of things being much more than they really are. I mean, every lawyer charges different amounts, of course, but if the scope of the assignment is relatively clear and small, the expense, it doesn't have to be through the roof. So, keep those ears attached to your head.
Definitely. So another thing I'm curious about is I know some people do watermarking in order to protect some of their content and from others stealing their content.
Yeah.
But do you think that that's a good way of protecting your intellectual property by watermarking your content?
I think it's a great approach. I mean, it's a technological solution to establishing the ownership and the timeline of when something existed in a particular form. It is not a substitute, though, for that copyright registration, because the watermark proves it was yours, but it still doesn't, provide the attorney's fees and statutory damages. And in the US now, the law says you're required to have a registration before you file your lawsuit anyway. So watermarks are great. It does allow you to track it and find stuff out on the internet, but I wouldn't call that a legal solution. It's a technological countermeasure, I guess you could call it.
Okay. So, I know a lot of people, when it comes to podcasts, like to use intro and outro music.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of times, a lot of podcasters, they get their logos done by other people from different freelancers from different sites that help them with their logos. And I know a lot of times these freelancers will put they're able to use the logo for commercial use. So are there any so if you get a logo done by one of these freelancers and it says that, do you as a podcaster own the do you own the logo itself, or does the person that created the logo have ownership of that?
That's a great question. Technically, under U.S. law, and most law follows this now around the world because we're signatory to some international treaties. The independent contractor that you hire to do the work for you actually owns the copyright in the material they create, unless they either transfer that ownership to you or the contract itself specifies that it's what we call a work made for hire. Certain kinds of works can be created that way under a contract that says it's work made for hire. And then the employer, not the employee, not the contractor, owns that work. So I would say, and unfortunately, most of these freelance sites that you're talking about don't really cover that in their basic agreement. So you would need to ask the specific question and insist on some specific language about those kinds of things, which it can be done. And sometimes they'll charge you a little more in order to do that. But definitely a good idea to have that conversation on the front end rather than after the fact. Another thing to watch out for with those freelance sites is, unfortunately, I've seen a handful of them, situations where the logo is finished and it looks great, and it includes an image that the designer didn't license. And so, and this happens with website design and all kinds of other things too. And so eventually what you get is a letter or a demand from, Getty Images or one of the stock photo companies demanding thousands of dollars for all the past infringement, because now you've got 100 episodes with that cover art or logo or something like that. So be really careful and make sure that the folks you're dealing with are taking care of all of that. Or if they let you know that they're not, they have to tell you where to get the rights to that particular image.
And so is it legal for you to play at least or even 30 seconds of one of your favorite artist songs on your actual podcast? Or is that something that all podcasters should not do? I know that's a big question. I know that's a general question for a lot of podcasters.
Well, the answer is really easy. It's maybe. So look, the general rule is if you use something that is owned by somebody else, you need their consent and permission for that, a license. So basically the answer should be no, don't use other people's stuff. There's a big exception in the law, and that is something called fair use. And it's a principle based on free speech, First Amendment, because look, there's an inherent conflict between a free speech, a constitutional provision that says Congress shall make no law infringing on free speech, right? And then there's a law that Congress made that says you can't copy that thing in your speech. So we have this inherent conflict, and over the decades of the 20th century, the courts developed this exception or defense called fair use. And it takes a complicated 4-factor analysis over what's the nature and purpose of the use in question, what's the purpose of the original one, what's how much was taken, amount and substantiality of what was taken, and what's the market impact of this on the original. If you balance all those factors, there's no rules of thumb. But if it balances in favor of the free speech side, then it's fair use. If it balances in favor of the other, then it's not. Unfortunately, no rules of thumb. You can't be sure until you get a judge or a jury to answer the question for you. So you're back into that long litigation, expensive process. So my general advice is don't use other people's stuff without their permission. That said, a very small snippet of, a piece of music, because you're talking about that artist or you're talking about that song in particular, could very well be fair use if there's a sort of a newsworthy or criticism and commentary kind of basis for using it. But you can't use, the first 10 seconds of AC/DC's Back in Black as the opening for your show every week, because that's definitely not criticism and commentary or newsworthy stuff. So it really depends on the context. And that's why I said the answer is maybe.
Yeah. And so do you feel like all podcasters should hire a lawyer? And I feel like I already know where your question's going to go.
Well, the lawyer in me says, oh, absolutely. I'm available. Here's my number. Give me a call.
Absolutely.
The fact of it is, most podcasters don't need a lawyer all the time. You don't need somebody on retainer unless you're doing a lot of this controversial kind of stuff. And you might once, look, if you need to register a trademark for your podcast, yeah, you should use a lawyer. If you need a particular kind of agreement, let's say you're bringing on sponsors and you want to have a good solid contract with your advertisers, you need a lawyer to draw up that contract. Or if you're starting a podcast network and you're going to bring on other shows, you need a lawyer for that. But for the day-to-day operation of a podcast, if you know the rules, if you understand them, the book that I mentioned earlier, it is probably a good resource. It's called The Podcast Blog and New Media Producers Legal Survival Guide.
Y'all go get that?
Yeah, you can find that at podcastlawbook.com. So, study up, know your rights, know your responsibilities, and hopefully you won't need someone like me, but once in a blue moon.
I'm just only a phone call away, just in case you need me.
And, I also do for the podcasters that are more in the do-it-yourself kind of mode. There's a lot of folks that are, they would do it themselves, but there's enough sort of fear or concern. This is technical, it's complicated stuff. I actually have an online course that I've created called Easy Legal for Podcasters. And that's another option too, where I sort of walk you through how to form your LLC or your corporation to protect your personal assets and separate things for the podcast, how to register your trademarks and copyrights and protect your ideas with trade secret, with non-disclosure agreements and things like that, how to build a team and get everybody signed on board. Because again, remember I said, when you have people working with you on your show, whether it's that guest or a producer or a co-host or anything, those people are going to start to look like co-owners, co-authors, unless you've got the right paperwork done to clarify. I call that like a podcast prenup.
Yes.
And then those advertiser and client relationships and things like that too. So we sort of cover all of that inside the course as well.
Yeah. And so speaking of LLCs, you say you would recommend podcasters actually get LLCs, especially if they plan on monetizing their podcast. So why do you feel that that's necessary for podcasters who want to make, podcasting their full-time job and not just a hobby?
I'd say it goes beyond just the folks that want to make it a full-time job. I would say that if you have personal assets, a home, significant bank accounts and retirement funds and things like that, it's really a good idea to separate your personal from your podcast and other things. Now, if your podcast is inside your business, it's part of promoting your coaching business or your professional services or whatever, maybe you don't need this separately. But if you're doing something that's not really related to another business, yeah, you should form a company for the podcast so that you've got that separateness. If somebody does end up suing because of something on the podcast, they're going after the show, the company, not your personal stuff. So that liability protection is one of the most important reasons to have a company structure. That podcast prenup part of it is another, where if you've got partners, you want to figure out who owns what and who's in charge of what and who's in control and what everybody's responsibilities are. Sometimes putting everybody inside the LLC is a good way to do that. If you're bringing in investors, that's another good reason to form a company. And of course, there's some street cred when sponsors are dealing with companies. They prefer to deal with companies. Look, everybody feels like that stability is important, even though it's largely a fiction in many ways. It's nice to have that sort of business name with LLC or Inc. in it to give people some comfort that they're dealing with someone who's going to be around a year from now or whatever.
Yeah. And so I know in the state of California, having an LLC, you have to pay higher yearly taxes on it. So for someone that just kind of starting off monetizing their show and they're not really generating as much revenue as say someone that's been doing this for a couple of years for now, or say like a Joe Rogan who's making millions of dollars. So, he could definitely have an LLC. So do you recommend someone that is just kind of starting off with their podcast and just getting a little bit of money starting to come in for their show? Do you recommend them getting an LLC since the yearly taxes in the state, especially in California, is much higher?
That may be a little too soon for thinking about this if you're just starting out. But if you're monetizing or if you're doing, things that have significant risk, like, if you're doing a sort of hard hitting show where you're talking about issues and people and things like that, you're more likely to have that defamation or privacy kind of stuff come in. It's something to think about. The other alternative on that liability protection side is insurance. And but unfortunately, the kind of insurance you need for this kind of business, what we call media errors and omissions insurance, is very expensive also. So if you have personal assets to insulate and protect, then I would say, forming the entity and or getting some insurance is a good idea. I was just talking to somebody about the insurance he bought, or I guess he's shopping for just last week. And it was going to cost him about $4,000 per year. Wow. So compared to the tax burden of the LLC, the LLC was easier. And he's not in California, so it's not as big an issue.
Well, that was a no-brainer in that situation.
Right.
So you also say that there's some tax advantages from actually having an LLC. So what are some of those tax advantages that you get, especially when it comes to being a podcaster with having an LLC as a podcaster?
Well, I'm going to give a double disclaimer here. First of all of what we've been talking about, I am a lawyer. I'm not your lawyer. I'm not the listener's lawyer just because they're listening to the show. I'm definitely not a tax advisor, and I only know a hair's thickness of tax stuff. What I'll say is, you can run the expenses of your podcast, all the equipment cost, all of the studio, everything you do to set up and get built, and all your operational stuff like hosting fees and things like that, all become business expenses if you run them through your LLC or your corporation. Sometimes if you don't have a company, the IRS will look at this as sort of hobby, and they won't let you take all those deductions. You can also use the company to set up a retirement plan for yourself and medical expense reimbursements and all kinds of other things that are, valuable ways to defer some income till later in life, or all kinds of different things. So definitely want to talk with a tax advisor about it as you get into making these decisions.
Yes, I definitely know you're not TurboTax or anything, but I do know you made that statement. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that. So everybody knows now he's not TurboTax, y'all. Don't call him for no tax information. So what do you feel like are some common mistakes that you see a lot of podcasters make when they first start off with podcasting?
Well, the first one is using music. It is the most common thing. People, either they want to use music or they do, and then they don't realize that they could have a problem. I think that's the biggest issue. Just not thinking about these kinds of issues generally, all the kind of stuff we've been talking about. Just coming at it as a purely as a hobby, amateur approach to things is nice. I mean, it's wonderful to have a hobby, but this is a kind of hobby that has consequences if you don't do it right. I guess there's lots of hobbies that are like that. You need to know the rules. So I would say that's the big mistake is thinking it's just like radio, or I'm going to make a show that's just like my favorite radio shows from when I was a kid. It's just not.
Yeah. And so what would you say are some of the crazy situations that you dealt with as a lawyer regarding either, trademark or copyright infringements, or any issues with guest release forms that you can share with everybody?
Well, I'll tell you the biggest blowback that I've seen in the podcasting world have involved two things. One, currently a client of mine is being sued for defamation for something that was, for a bunch of things that were said on their podcast and on the podcast web pages and social media and stuff like that. I think it's a bogus suit. I'm not actually handling the defense of that suit because it's in another state, but somebody got angry over things that were said on the show, and they're determined to make an example out of this client. Fortunately, they have a company, and they do have insurance that will pay for some of the legal fees and things like that. The other side, this is a few years ago, and this is what sort of set me off on the crusade about releases, is a podcaster who does consider herself a journalist and thinks like a journalist, had a guest on her show in her earliest season talking about a specific issue. That guest is an expert and has a particular point of view on that issue. Years later, the show not shifted its focus, but they had a counterpoint, an expert on the other side, come on the show. And the original guest from the first one demanded that it be taken out. I don't want to be associated with your podcast anymore. I want nothing to do with it. Take it all down, my episode. Don't mention my name, et cetera, et cetera. So my client, said, well, I don't want to take it down, but if you insist, I would like you to write an explanation of why. What's your point of view that you have decided that you don't want to be on my feed anymore with this old episode? And the woman refused to write anything. No, I don't want any reference. I don't want anybody who runs a Google search to find my name on this podcast anymore. My client said, you know what? No, this is journalism. I'm doing a public service. This is important information. And I'm not going to take it down, or I'll write my own, I think it was what she said. And so the guest sued, and it was actually characterized as a $15 million lawsuit, which was preposterous.
Yes.
There's no way she had those kind of damages. But in the absence of a written agreement, my client was sort of stuck in this place of having to cave in to these ridiculous demands, or pay tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees to fight over this, still relatively young podcast that wasn't generating any revenue for her. So those are the kinds of nightmare scenarios that can happen. Had she had a company in place, it might have helped. It might have, kept her family assets off the chopping block there. So.
Yeah. And that's why I keep reiterating for everybody to know your legal rights as a podcaster. There's so many people that get in here just wanting to do it as a hobby. And like I said, some people want to do it as an actual career path for themselves, but it's important for you to protect yourself. So I encourage everybody out there to go and download the Podcast Lawyer, Gordon Firemark's guest release form, protect yourself, hire him as a lawyer for you, honey. I know he can't do any taxes for you, but he can give you some legal advice a little bit on the tax advantages to having an LLC. So yes, everybody protect yourself. You don't want to get in these types of situations, because $15 million, wow. Like this. Do you even know the outcome of this situation? Did she ended up having to pay like the $15 million that the lady was asking for? Or wasn't
anywhere near $15 million. There was a settlement, and I'm not really at liberty to discuss the figures and things like that, but it was a relatively, I won't say it's a relatively small payment. Compared to $15 million, it was relatively small. But, for this average person who, is just a normal person with a family, writing that check was painful.
I bet. It's painful for me to even hear this story.
Right.
Wow. So I know a lot of times with a lot of influencers and some YouTubers and even podcasters, they'll advertise other people's products.
Yeah.
And I know, and now they have, especially on Instagram and Facebook, that if you're advertising certain products, you have to say whether or not it's a paid ad or if it's a sponsored ad. So what are some legal issues that you can run into if you are a podcaster, or a YouTuber, or even an influencer that is sponsoring other people's products, and the products actually do not depict the actual reviews that are being brought up on the particular product or the company itself? Why do they have these rules in place on like Instagram and Facebook now?
Yeah. It's actually a legal requirement. The FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, regulates false advertising, and marketing messages are considered advertising. So when that influencer talks about a particular brand and that brand is paying him or her, either in goods or in money, the public has a right to know. I mean, when you think about it, if I do a podcast episode where I talk, all about how great, Apple computers are. I love my Mac. I love my iPad. I love my iPhone. It's fantastic. And then you went out and bought a Mac, or went out and decided to shop, and maybe you'll get a Mac. Wouldn't you like to have known that I got paid for saying all those nice things about Macintosh?
Absolutely.
Right. So same goes for when Kim Kardashian goes out carrying that Gucci bag, or someone talks about this nutritional supplement that they use that they love. You want to know, right? It's
Absolutely.
not just how much they love it, but they love it because they're getting paid.
Exactly.
So anytime you're advertising, this goes for affiliate ads too. When I mention a product and how you can get it on Amazon, and if you just go to the link in my show notes, most people kind of get it, but you need to say, and when you click on my link, I'm going to receive a commission on that sale. Thank you very much. Doesn't cost you anything more, but you have a right and a need to know that. So it's all about transparency. For podcasters, this also applies to, and this is maybe a little controversial opinion. If you have a show where your guests pay you to be guests on the show, I think that's an endorsement of that guest. And you need to tell the audience same thing. Hey, our next guest paid us to be on the show. Here's, please welcome so-and-so. And it'll just make the audience take things with a little more grain of salt. And there are lots of these pay-to-play podcasts out there. So be thoughtful about this. Transparency is key.
Yeah, it's almost kind of like, they say in the radio industry, payola, how an artist gives their music to be played and then they pay the actual radio company to play it. And it's the same thing going on now with podcasters. I don't know if we would call it payola, but I guess it still is the same.
Yeah, payola is an old term. It comes back to the 1940s and 50s, actually. But it is sort of the same thing. And we need to be careful about that. I had another train of thought and it left the station without me.
Oh, it's okay. It happens to me all of the time. But I will say that, we live in a world of social media where everything is just smoke and mirrors. And so you don't know what's true or what's false. You see so many people advertising, teas and stuff like that. Oh, you get this tea and you'll lose like 25 pounds in 2 days or whatever. And it's like, come on now. To me, it's like obvious that it's not true. But it, like you said, it's good to know whether or not the person is getting paid to say this, because that kind of lets the other people, the consumers know that this product may or may not work for them. It lets them to be able to decide whether or not they should make the purchase for themselves. So,
the regulations really are about false and misleading advertising. And I would say that if you aren't telling your audience that you're being compensated for the message you're sharing, that's misleading them. Absolutely. And there you go.
Yeah. So you also say that a cease and desist letter can be a little tricky and costly litigation. So what are some roadblocks people often run into with a cease and desist letter, and what type of action should you take in these situations?
Well, a cease and desist is really just a demand. Someone is saying, hey, I don't like what you're doing. I want you to stop it. And that's fine. That's great, actually. Nowadays, with digital stuff online, we also have the DMCA takedown procedure where you can, if you're a copyright owner, you can notify the hosting company, hey, that episode of that show at this URL, is using my copyrighted stuff, and they take it down right away because they want to avoid getting sued, and this is their protection. If they comply with these policies, they can avoid that lawsuit. They're in what's called a safe harbor. But the cease and desist is the, my lawyer sending you a demand. Take that down. Stop what you're doing. Don't you dare. Those kinds of things. The trouble is, and this is what I think you're referring to, is if somebody sends a cease and desist letter, they are creating a case or controversy, or at least the potential for the threat of a case or controversy. And that threat of a lawsuit is sometimes enough for the recipient of the cease and desist letter to file suit first and say, hey, I'm not doing anything wrong, judge. Please tell them I'm not doing anything wrong. Mm-hmm. And once that lawsuit starts, it's a freight train going down the tracks, and you have to keep running to stay ahead of it. And so you shouldn't do cease and desist unless you're ready to, to follow through and pursue that litigation. Oftentimes the cease and desist is all it takes. Hey, stop it. I don't like what you're doing. And it gets them thinking, oh, I didn't realize I was hurting somebody. I have one client with a very, a trademarked title for her show. And unfortunately, it's one of those titles that everybody thinks, oh, I should call it this. And so I would say probably 5 or 6 times a year, somebody comes up and starts a podcast with a very similar title. And so she's contacts me and says, should we send them a cease and desist? And I say, why don't you send them a quick email first, just saying, hey, don't know if you know this. I have a trademark. What you're doing infringes it. I'd really like it if you would stop before I have to bring the lawyers in. And 9 times out of 10, they stop. Oh, gosh, I had no idea. I'm sorry. Because they didn't do that search we talked about earlier. Exactly. Had they done the search, then someone might have said, oh, well, I probably shouldn't use that title. So that's sort of the kind of thing. So, I guess it takes money out of my pocket, but on the other hand, it keeps her out of the courtroom, and I wouldn't have her as a client again if I ended up having to charge her tens of thousands of dollars of litigation, or if she ended up having to pay, litigation fees for things. So sometimes a little honey is better than vinegar.
Exactly. Definitely. And, like you said, there's so many people out there there are people out there that are not really aware of the legalities with it, or they don't know how to do the searches to see whether or not that whether the name is taken or not. So, like you said, to her, just simply sending out a little email that stopped a lot of the headache that she would have to go through with the whole cease and desist letter.
Yeah. And it's really sort of killing them with kindness, just saying, I'm sorry to have to do this, but my lawyer says if I don't, I could lose my rights. Yes. So I've got to ask you to stop.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And with that said, I want to thank you so much, Gordon, for joining me today on another episode of Vibe Selection. Let everybody know where they can connect with you or retain you as a lawyer.
Well, Kyra, thank you so much for having me. You can reach me at just my name, GordonFiremark.com. You can find me on social media. Gordon G Firemark is the way I usually do things on social. And if you're looking for specifically help with podcasts, thepodcastlawyer.com is another great place.
Yes. And they can also find the guest release form on your website as well, correct?
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And I want to thank all of you else for listening, for tuning in to another episode of Vibe Selection. I am your host, Kyra. And if you'd like to support the Vibe Selection podcast, you can do so at www.teespring or patreon.com/Vibe Selection. If you like any Vibe Selection merchandise, you can grab that at www.teespring.com/Vibe Selection. Or if you'd like to follow me on IG, you can do so at I am Kyra Mahoney. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Vibe Selection. I'll see you all next week. Stay safe, stay healthy out there. Bye.
Thank you for joining Vibe Selection with Kyra. Come vibe out with us again next time and hear the latest on today's hot topics. Find us on Instagram at I am Kyra Mahoney or donate at www.patreon.com/Vibe Selection.